Hey everyone, I'm Singh. I'm the creator of Breadcrumb.vc and the Network Effects course, which are resources for investors and founders to learn about network effects. I'm also part of the Atomico Angel program, and I exclusively invest in startups with network effects. Now, today I'm going to be talking about metrics, specifically how you can measure these network effects. So feel free to drop your questions into the chat as I'm presenting, and I'll get to them at the very end. Now, how do you begin a KPI setting process for a startup? A lot of times, folks jump straight into the data. That's a mistake. Data is the last step of the process. It's not the first step because it's very, very easy to get lost in it. The first step is to understand the product or the business that you need to measure. And that's even more important if your startup has network effects. That's when the addition of a user makes the product more valuable for all users, which means you don't entirely control the value of the product yourself. It depends on who else is using it. So you need to understand user behavior, which comes down to metrics. And if you need to understand this, you need to know what type of network effect you have, because that's going to affect your user journey and behavior. Oops. So let's start by listing out the types of network effects that you can have. First, you have data networks that collect data from users to improve the value of the product for the same users. So here you have companies like Waze, Truecaller, TripAdvisor. You can have interaction networks that connect users to enable direct interactions and information exchange. So here you have social networks, P2P payment networks, dating apps, multiplayer games, and a few others. You can have marketplaces that connect two or more distinct types of users and allow them to buy and sell products or services. Loads of examples here: Airbnb, Uber, Spock, Amazon. And finally, you have platforms that enable software developers to build or integrate their apps on top of an existing product and then connect them to their users. iOS, Google Play are obvious examples. Shopify, Salesforce, and Atlassian are also good examples. Interaction networks and marketplaces can also have a SaaS component, where you start using software by yourself first, and then over time begin to use a network or a marketplace. Now, all data networks and most interaction networks are one-sided, and all marketplaces and platforms are multi-sided, which means they have at least two or more types of users. So now that you know all this, you need to answer two questions before you even think about metrics. Which of these categories do you actually fall under? That's the first question. And the second is, do you actually have critical mass or liquidity? Which means, do you have enough users or engagement on your product for it to have some value to a new user today? Because if you have network effects, your product doesn't actually have any value without those users. So let's first start pre-liquidity, if you're a one-sided network. So this includes data networks like Waze and most interaction networks like Facebook or Snapchat. Now, like any network, the route to liquidity always begins with acquiring a user. But the primary driver of liquidity isn't just the presence of this user. It's a user who's actually creating value for others. So you need to measure conversion to a core action, which is a specific action or set of actions that a user takes that makes the network more valuable for others. And this needs to be completed on an ongoing basis, on a recurring basis. So you measure the retention of this action, ideally with cohorts. Now, what this core action is can vary based on the value prop. So on a data network like Waze, the core action would be submitting a report, which is contributing data. On an interaction network like Snapchat, it's going to be sending a picture or a message. Now, this part really needs a case study. You wouldn't believe how many founders and investors make some very obvious mistakes with retention, which seems like an obvious metric. And it's very easy to spot where these mistakes happen once you understand this concept of a core action. So let me take you through a couple of cases that I've seen. I won't identify the startups, and the data here is made up, but it's directionally accurate. Both examples I'm going to show you are basically consumer networks. Startup A showed me a retention curve that looked like this. So 75% of their users were still around after 6 months, which clearly looks like top-notch retention, like this is going to be a unicorn, until you looked at what retention actually meant. To use this product, a user would have to connect multiple accounts of a certain type. Let's say they were online shopping accounts. And they counted someone as a retained user if that user still had accounts connected in the following month. So that 75% retention actually meant that 25% of their users deliberately came back to disconnect their accounts. That doesn't mean that 3/4 of your users loved your product. It tells you that 1/4 really, really hated it. And the retention to core action, which is users actually coming back to do something meaningful on the product, was in the low single digits. So now look at startup B. They showed me a set of retention curves that look like this. Now they defined retention as a user coming back to open the app, which is the more traditional understanding of retention. That's the lower, darker blue line. This flattened out at about 20%, which is about average for a consumer network, nothing special. But the retention to core action, which is that lighter blue line on top, that flattened out at 50%. That's fantastic retention. That was when users actually interacted with other users, which was really the purpose of the app. Now, many investors thought they had a retention issue because of that first 20% number, that darker blue line on the right. But they actually didn't have a retention problem, because once users became activated, when they interacted with others, they stuck around. Instead, they had a conversion to core action problem, because a lot of users never actually did that. And usually, that's easier to solve. Often you just need to improve your onboarding flow, simplify your UX, clear up your language, so you're attracting the right kind of users and helping them along that journey. And to no surprise, when they fixed those things, their overall retention metric went up and started catching up with their retention to core action. So this goes to show you, metrics really mean nothing without context. So it's very, very important to understand the user journey and the core action when you're setting up or evaluating metrics. So all of this was for one-sided networks, when you have one type of user. Multi-sided networks are a bit more complicated. So these are marketplaces like Airbnb or Uber, or platforms like iOS or Shopify. Because now you're allowing different types of participants to interact or transact. So you need to maintain liquidity on both the demand and the supply sides. And that makes it more complex to measure. So here again, you begin by measuring demand and supply acquisition. On the demand side, you measure the search to fill ratio, which is the percentage of buyer searches that lead to a completed transaction. You can also define more attributes for a successful transaction. For example, you need to have a positive review after every transaction. You need to have a minimum basket size, and you only count it as a successful transaction if they meet all those attributes. In some cases, you can also substitute this or complement it with something called time to fill, which is the time taken to fulfill a buyer request. And that's most relevant for marketplaces that have commoditized supply like Uber or Deliveroo. On the supply side, your liquidity metrics are going to vary based on the kind of supply you have. You can have high-touch supply, where each unit of supply can serve a limited amount of demand. So like on Airbnb, a single property can accommodate one booking at a time. An Uber driver can usually accommodate one booking at a time. If it's Uber Pool, he can accommodate maybe 2 or 3 at most, but it's still very limited. So in this case, you need to track the utilization rate, which is the percentage of available capacity on your marketplace that's being utilized. You can also have low-touch supply, where each unit of supply can support any amount of demand or a very large amount of demand. So like on Udemy, for example, once you upload a course, that can support as many students as you need to. Or once you put an app up on the iOS App Store, it can support any number of downloads. The utilization rate is no longer relevant. So here you substitute that with a measure for the economic incentive for supply. How much incremental revenue or traffic are they getting from you versus the status quo or somewhere else? Sometimes you can measure this with share of wallet, depending on the kind of marketplace it is. If one of these metrics falls short, it tells you have a liquidity problem, but not where. To answer that question, you need to take a more granular look at supply density, which is the ratio of active buyers to suppliers in each region, or in each category, or both, depending on the kind of marketplace you have. And this can change very, very quickly for marketplaces that have site switching, where buyers and sellers can swap places. They play both roles, like Spock, for example. So here you also keep an eye on the rate of conversion from buyers to sellers. And finally, there's one more liquidity metric that's specific to platforms and SaaS-enabled marketplaces. Now, a platform is never really an isolated business. It's built on an underlying product that has pre-existing customers. So the iOS App Store was the platform, and the iPhone was the underlying product. And the Shopify App Store is the platform, and Shopify is the underlying product. And so liquidity also depends on customer penetration, which is the percentage of the underlying product's customers that are using developer applications. So in Shopify's case, last I checked, that was about 87%. 87% of Shopify merchants were using at least one Shopify app. And you can also apply this to SaaS-enabled marketplaces, which are products that sell or give away software and then tack on a marketplace later, like OpenTable. So then what percentage of the SaaS customer base you have is using the marketplace? Now, if all of these metrics look right, congrats, you've reached liquidity. It's a big step. That's the point you can say that you actually have product market fit. Now, after you reach that threshold, you should still continue to track these metrics to maintain liquidity. But at that point, growth, unit economics, and defensibility are going to become more important. Now, there's only one way to prove that you have liquidity, which means that network effects are currently active on your product. You have to establish a direct relationship between growth, engagement, and product value. That's basically the flywheel that everyone loves to talk about. Now, this flywheel is not the same as a growth loop, although they are somewhat similar concepts. You don't need network effects to have a growth loop. A purely viral product that doesn't have any network effects like Zoom can also have a viral growth loop. The key difference between them is that viral growth loops are not linked to the value of the product, which means that users can invite others, but that doesn't affect their product experience. So growth loops can be sometimes difficult to sustain, and they definitely don't get stronger without intervention. But a flywheel that's powered by network effects is both self-sustaining and gets stronger over time. In a network effects flywheel, increasing adoption is going to increase product value, which will give you higher engagement and higher LTV. Now, that should result in higher organic adoption, more engagement, and even higher product value. So that's a virtuous cycle. But how do you measure this in a systematic way? Start with increasing adoption, which will always be, or almost always be, organic adoption. Now, organic user acquisition can happen in two ways. The first is organic search, which is new users seeking out your product. So here you just track your traffic sources. The second is user referrals, which is existing users inviting others to your product from an in-app referral link or in-product referral link. You can track this with the viral coefficient or K factor, which is the number of new signups that each user generates. And you can measure the overall effectiveness of organic acquisition with the word of mouth coefficient, which is the number of new organic users that your existing user base generates. This was first defined by Reforge. Increasing organic adoption should drive down your blended customer acquisition costs over time, because your mix should be shifting towards organic as your product becomes more and more valuable. Depending on your network type, there are a couple of things you will need to manage as you grow. On interaction networks, you need to ensure that network density stays healthy as you grow. And network density is the ratio of the number of connections to the number of users you have. You want to make sure that the number of connections grows along with the network. If new users only have one connection or no connections, that's going to affect the value they get from the product. That's a problem. On marketplaces and platforms, you need to maintain supply density as you grow. So you can't have supply or demand go out of whack, because then one of them will have a bad experience. If you manage all of this well, your product value and engagement should increase over time. You can verify that with engagement cohorts. Each cohort should get more engaged over time, and later cohorts should get more engaged than previous cohorts after you adjust for your early adopter power users. For marketplaces, you need separate cohorts for the demand and supply sides. Engagement cohorts on the demand side and net revenue retention cohorts for supply. And all of this will have a direct impact on LTV. Depending on the monetization model, it will also be influenced by things like ad load, basket size, purchase frequency, conversion, take rate. Depends on exactly how you make money. And so if your CAC's going down, your LTV is going up, your LTV to CAC ratio should rise sharply as your network scales. The degree of that will depend on the type of network effect you actually have. Now, growth metrics are another area where I've seen founders and investors make some mistakes. Now, most people just focus on the K factor, which can be misleading. And a lot of people haven't heard about the word of mouth coefficient. Now, here's a case study that shows you why this can be a problem. This again is based on a real startup, which I won't identify. And again, the data isn't real, but it's directionally accurate. A lot of times you'll come across metrics that look like this, where the K factor looks very, very low, but the word of mouth coefficient looks consistently high. And usually this happens when the in-app referral loop isn't as impactful as word of mouth virality. For example, telling friends on a WhatsApp group to download an app, which might be easier than sharing an in-app referral link for some use cases. If that's the case, the K factor isn't really very meaningful because users are spreading the word verbally instead. So the word of mouth coefficient is more representative. And this will happen on dating apps like Tinder, for example. You're less likely to invite someone to Tinder from within the app, but you're likely to tell your friends about it. But the word of mouth coefficient also has a problem, which is obvious from this chart. And this is from the same startup. Now this shows the K factor and word of mouth coefficient over a year. And you can see there's a big spike in the word of mouth coefficient in the middle of the year. It's not like the startup suddenly got more viral. Instead, they ran an influencer campaign, and the bump is the organic lift from the campaign. And you saw an influencer talk about something on TikTok, and you go search for it on the App Store or on Google, which means the word of mouth coefficient can be distorted by paid marketing. But the K factor is immune from that because it only picks up users specifically invited by other users from a link. And so to summarize, both the K factor and the word of mouth coefficient, they will have advantages and disadvantages. And depending on the context, one might be more useful than the other. But your job is to assess which really is the most representative in each situation. Whether you're a founder or an investor, that's important for you to do. The very last topic we have is defensibility. Now, the primary factors that affect defensibility, they tend to be structural. They don't really change very often. And so you can't measure them regularly, even though they're very, very important to understand. The only exception to this is multi-tenanting. That's when users are active on multiple networks that have similar needs or meet similar needs, because that's a leading indicator of churn. And so it makes it important to track at least on a semi-regular basis, maybe not daily or weekly, but at least quarterly. The only challenge here is that you need to measure usage across a competitor's products in addition to your own, which is obviously only possible with surveys or third-party datasets. One example of this is the exclusive reach analysis that Snapchat used to publish. So they used to say 38% of their daily active users did not use Instagram on any given day, and 83% did not use Twitter. And so that's obviously useful information for advertisers, but also useful for them to figure out where their threats are coming from. All right, so that's all I've got for you today. This presentation was a small excerpt from the Network Effects course, which is a cohort-based course that I run. You can learn more about that at course.breadcrumb.vc, and all marketplace conference attendees are going to get a discount for the next cohort in January. So now let me get to the questions. Are there any questions? Let me look at the chat. Okay, there's no questions so far, so we still have a few minutes left, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat. Anything you want to know about metrics for your marketplace or any other types of network effect startups? Metrics can be a... Okay, question, is it possible to get a copy of my slides? I'm sure you can. The marketplace conference team, I think, are going to be recording these and sharing these recordings on YouTube, which is normally what happens, but I think the team can give you a better answer. But I also have an essay version of this for available on breadcrumb.vc. Next question is, can I please summarize the key metrics for marketplaces? Depends on the stage of your marketplace, like I mentioned, right? So if you're pre-liquidity, which is you're still building up your marketplace in the early stages, the things you need to measure are, on the demand side, the search to fill ratio, on the supply side, utilization rate or share of wallet, and most importantly, supply density, which is the ratio of buyers to active buyers to suppliers in every region or in every category, depending on your marketplace. If you're a marketplace like Uber, hyper-local, where you need people to be in the same place, you need to look at the supply to demand ratio in each region. If you're a marketplace like Airbnb that has loads of different categories of supplies, like villas, beach on a beach, apartments in a city center, then you need to take a look at supply demand ratio in each category of supply. Next question is how to measure supply density. I think I just answered that. So it's just about you've got the ratio of supply to demand, and you need to cut those up based on how you're matching supply and demand, whether it's being matched within each region or if you have different categories of supply. So then you kind of match up suppliers in a category and buyers looking in that specific category. Buyers looking for an apartment in Rome, for example. Next question, at very early stage, how important are all those metrics and what tool is the best? I mean, what tool tends to be subjective. A lot of my portfolio companies use things like Amplitude and Mixpanel, and generally have seen pretty good results with either of them. So the tool, I'd say, is less important than kind of what you're measuring. And as to how important are all these metrics, many of the metrics like the LTV to CAC ratio and stuff are really not that important. What's exceptionally important if you're a one-sided network is retention. Like, people assume retention is not important at an early stage. It's very, very important. If you're a marketplace, that search to fill ratio is really important, meaning you need to have high liquidity within a small niche. Even if you have 20 users, those users should be transacting on a fairly high clip. So you want to show high levels of activity with a small base of users. That's kind of what you want to show from a metrics point of view. Oops, loads of questions all of a sudden. How do you get network effects from day one when you have 0 users? Any tips? That's a great question. I mean, that's a whole nother topic. You're basically talking about how you solve the cold start problem. And it depends on the kind of product you are, right? There's lots of different hacks you can go about. One of them is try to find users that are already connected and already transacting with each other, and you try and get them to adopt your software because it's a better way to interact. So that's one way. The second way is kind of the come for the tool, stay for the network approach, where you've got a software that people can use by themselves, a software, a tool, or whatever it is, and you give it away or you sell it to people. And once you have enough people using this by themselves, you start connecting them to each other. So those are two among sort of loads of different approaches. It's a very, very long topic. Next question, how long should you wait to reach liquidity? And how long should you decide that you don't have product market fit? Ooh, that's a good question. Now, the question of how long should you wait to reach liquidity, the idea is to reach liquidity as quickly as possible, because until you have liquidity, you don't really have a product. So again, the goal is to figure out, for example, if you're a social network, the easiest way to reach liquidity would not be to kind of put your product out into the ether. It would be go to a college or a high school where you already have tight-knit social networks that interact on a very frequent basis, and you get them to adopt it. And they start interacting with each other on a frequent basis, and you leverage that user base to get more. If you're a marketplace, you find a niche that really is dying for your product. Like, they cannot find any other way to find demand or find supply. And you get them to start using your product. And that's your initial foothold. And you get these 20, 30, 40 buyers and sellers to start transacting with each other. And you leverage their presence to attract more buyers and more sellers. So you kind of ladder up. So getting that initial dense base is very, very important. And how long should you decide that you don't have product market fit? Honestly, if you've been at this for a couple of months and you haven't found a way to attract a group that is densely connected and wants to transact or needs this product, it's probably time to start thinking about pivoting. I would not leave this for very, very long. Next question, what metrics do you think are popular but not useful to measure growth for a marketplace business? A month-on-month GMV growth, especially at a very, very early stage, that's about as much of a vanity metric as you can find. It's something that it's very popular with investors because you kind of see line goes up, but it tells you very little about the actual underlying health of a business. Because if you go out and if you acquire an awful lot of users, sometimes you can get these metrics to temporarily start creeping up, but kind of the unit economics might not actually make sense. So I'd always look for the underlying sort of conversion, search to fill, utilization rate, stuff like that to figure out the health of the business. The liquidity metrics are really very, very important. Could you give us other examples of defensibility metrics? There actually aren't any. In my mind, defensibility is very structural. So, for example, on a marketplace, the biggest driver of defensibility is how diverse supply is. So, how many different categories of supply do you have? On Uber, you have just drivers. Maybe some of those drivers drive slightly bigger cars, but apart from that, there's really no diversity to it. And so Uber had a ton of competition. On Airbnb, the supply is incredibly diverse. In every city, you've got different types of properties, different capacities, different attributes to those properties. Everyone's looking for something different. And so once you aggregate that really long tail of supply, it becomes very, very difficult for someone to compete with you, because you can't just go, I have apartments in 5 cities, and so I can compete with Airbnb, because people might want something different and people's needs keep changing. And for an interaction network, how unique each node is really matters, because you want to connect with individual people, which is why one of the most defensible networks of all time was the original telephone network, because if someone didn't have a telephone network, you could not contact them. It didn't matter if the telephone network had 1 million users. You wanted to contact one person. It didn't matter if there were 1 million or 10 million users on the telephone network if that person wasn't there. And so that becomes very, very defensible, but it's really very hard to measure it. It's much more qualitative, the driver of defensibility. Next question is, how do you define a node? Beyond geo or group? Not entirely sure what that question means, but a node is really just any participant in a network. Every user of a marketplace or an interaction network or a data network or a platform, whether there's a supplier or a buyer, they're a node in the network. Now, in terms of which nodes are most relevant, it depends on kind of who that node interacts with. So on Uber, all the nodes, all the drivers and riders need to be within a 1 mile radius if they want to interact. So that's the most relevant sets of nodes for you. Whereas on Airbnb, and I keep using these examples because they're so different, the two of them, you can have sort of one node in New York and the other node in Japan, and someone's traveling from Japan to New York, they can interact with each other. So it's really specific to the nature of the marketplace and kind of what the range of those network effects is. What's next? A pop-up store marketplace. I'm not sure what that means. Next question is, you talked about measuring utilization, but what are some sample ways to measure that? Okay, that's an easy one. So again, using the example of Uber. So let's say you've got 100 drivers on the network, and each driver is available for an hour a day. So kind of that's your available capacity. And the utilization is basically of these 100 driver man hours, what percentage of that time are they actually spending driving someone to a destination? So that's the utilization of that capacity. For other networks, it could be something different. For Airbnb, for example, it could be effectively the what percentage of properties are occupied for what percentage of the year. Any other questions? We've got exactly 1 minute left. All right, I think we've covered everything. That was a lot of questions. Thanks, everyone. I hope that was useful. And if you need to get in touch with me, you can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, or I'm at Samir at breadcrumb.vc. Thanks all.